Today's police officer is a combination of crime fighter, detective, first responder, and social worker who faces a myriad of challenges and criminals that didn't exist a generation ago. Terrorism and cybercrime are just a few of the new threats to the safety of any community that are on the rise and are extremely challenging to address for police officers. At the same time, as Wally Oppal says, the public has very high expectations of the police, expectations that in most cases he says the police are meeting. He goes on to say, I think in Western democratic societies, we probably have the best policing in the world, and that is due in large part to the high level of qualifications and training that are needed to be a police officer in Canada. What is clear is the web of security forces that are now compelled to work together and coordinate their efforts is expanding. No one security system can meet the needs of society, business, and industry, and our changing requirement to guard against terrorism. We invited Justice Wally Oppal, the man who is heading up the review on education and training of police officers in BC, to join us for a conversation that matters about preparing law enforcement officers for their role over the next few decades.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program of the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the following and viewers like you. Please become a patron at conversationsthatmatter.tv.
You hold a unique position in understanding the nature of policing in Canada and in British Columbia in particular. As we enter the 21st century, the world of policing has changed dramatically. There is a suggestion that it's going under probably the greatest transformation since modern policing was first developed by Sir Robert Peel in the UK. Where are we at right now? And then let's talk about how do we prepare police officers for the future.
Policing has changed in order to meet with the demands of our society at large, which has changed. You don't need to have any empirical evidence to know how Canada's population makeup, the demographics, have significantly changed. The city of Vancouver now has a population that's over 40% foreign-born. We have a multicultural community, people coming here from many, many lands, many parts of the world, and we rely on immigration. So the police need to adjust to the ways of the people who come here. And by that I mean that if the police are going to have any kind of credibility, and if they're going to have the assistance, if they seek the assistance of the community at large in order to solve crimes, in order to establish law and order, they're going to have to be able to communicate with the people that are here. Not only that, but we live in an era of accountability where people want accountability from their institutions, whether they're the police, whether that's Parliament, whether they're civic governments and various other institutions that interact with the public. So the job of police officers has become a lot more complex.
So you talk about that changing demographics within society. So let's go back to the principles of Sir Robert Peel, who basically said we police with the community rather than policing the community, which is a distinctive difference between what we do here as a police service versus in the United States as a police force.
Yes.
I'm sure that there are people who would go, well, hang on a second. Despite the fact that the demographics are changing, is it not the responsibility of the citizen to rise up to the standard and meet the law rather than the law adapting to meet the needs of that society? And so it's a complex interplay, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no question that the police need the help of the community. The community has changed, so the police have to adapt their ways. I mean, the job of a police officer, for instance, in the city of Vancouver, has become much more complex because our expectations of the police are unrealistically high. We expect now the police to be not only enforcers of the law, but also social workers and people who have to deal with, police have to deal with people with mental illnesses, poverty, homelessness, and all of those that are social factors, and the police unfortunately have to be in the position where they have to deal with these people on a daily basis.
Just got to get you to hang on for a second while
Sure.
we take
All
a
right.
quick commercial break.
Okay.
We'll be right back. Conversations That Matter is brought to you by Odlum Brown, a client-focused investment firm that starts client relationships with straightforward conversations focused on you, your aspirations, and your investment priorities. Odlum Brown has been a supporter of Conversations That Matter from the day we started this show. Their only condition was that we provide a non-biased conversation with people from all sides of all sorts of issues. And of course, we couldn't produce this show without the support of Oh Boy Productions. If you're looking to produce a show like this one, I suggest you reach out to Oh Boy. They can help you produce it, and they can help you build your audience. And we also need your support. I ask you to please pledge $1 per show by going to conversationsthatmatter.tv/donate, because those dollars add up and play an important role in helping us produce this show. Now, back to the show. So, they're first responders.
Yes.
And their resources are tight. Finances also obviously play a role. What is the budget of the police department? How many police officers can you have? How do you allocate them? And the structure within a police department starts changing. Let's just take one change right now, which has been the legalization of marijuana. Has that in some ways freed up some resources for police departments, or had they already anticipated that?
Yes and no, but the marijuana legislation in and of itself is complex, so there are other tasks that the police have to perform. For instance, what do you do about the many storefront offices that have been open illegally for a long period of time, serve the public, and it's the task of the police, or at least law enforcement officers, to shut down those people who don't have proper licenses. Mm-hmm. So that's another factor. The other thing is there are still obligations on the police to ensure that people who consume marijuana aren't driving. So the impaired driving legislation that dealt with alcohol now has been expanded to people who are impaired by a drug. So the task changes. It's not any easier.
No, it's not any easier.
In fact, the breathalyzer gave you a finite definition of the amount of alcohol in one system, but we're still wrestling with how much marijuana, the residue of marijuana in a person's blood will impair that person's ability to drive.
And we don't really have an accurate measuring system.
We don't.
Because none of that work was done on what was an illegal substance before.
Yeah. I think, though, what we have to do here is rely on the expertise of the police. The police officer typically will see aberrant driving taking place. They will go and stop that vehicle, and they'll look at the symptoms, the physical symptoms. No doubt there'll be some kind of odor, and from that they may be able to draw the inference that the person's ability to drive was impaired by a drug.
But would an inference stand up in court?
I think, absolutely.
Yeah?
It depends on the strength of the evidence, and the judges are pretty wise to the evidence that they hear, so they can make the appropriate decisions.
Yeah, I only bring that up because policing is now a tricky business. It's far more complex. There's far more elements that police officers are working with. So we have frontline police officers who are, in essence, keeping the peace on the street, and they're the first responders to incidents that happen. What is the single biggest issue that they face? And then let's start to move within the organization and say, okay, but policing is far more than just the front line.
Well, the single most issue that they face is they have to deal with all the ills of society. They have to deal with issues that in many ways they're not qualified to do, and we expect them to do it. We have a very high expectation of the police. The reason for that is that we probably have, in the Western democracies, the best policing system in the world. I say that because no time in history had the requirements of police been higher than they are now. You can't get into the Vancouver Police Department or any of the RCMP or any of the local police forces unless you have some kind of post-secondary training. Mm-hmm. Most of them have university degrees, sociology, psychology, even the law. So you're getting better qualified people now that are going into policing the requirements are higher than any time in the past. So there's no doubt that the police are more qualified than before. But having said that, we do expect them to get involved in areas of expertise that they may not be qualified for.
So you're talking about a professional police force where there is a higher standard.
Yeah.
But when you ask people to come with those kinds of credentials, they also expect appropriate compensation. Are we paying police appropriately?
I think we are. I think if you look at any city's budget, I'm sure a lot of police will disagree with me when I say this, but
Well,
it's
the
a
cost
large,
of living is a big
absolutely.
challenge.
Well, absolutely, and we'll get into that in a minute. But what's happened is that we pay them well. The police chiefs make income that's right up there with the judges at Supreme Court of Canada. I mean, they do very well, and they should,
and rightly so.
Absolutely, yeah. And I don't begrudge them for a minute, but so the budgets of any municipality will have a disproportionately high amount of money going towards policing, and that's because we want the police to do a good job. We want highly qualified people to get involved in policing.
Even still, when we take a look at the cost of living, let's say in a city like Vancouver, you're asking a police officer who makes a reasonably good wage to say they have to make housing choices that frequently put them a fair distance away from the area that they police. And does that not put the community at risk when you need to call in people who are off duty? So do we also as a city need to be able to say we need to have designated housing opportunities for those first responders?
That's a very good question, because now you get so many members of the VPD who don't live in the city of Vancouver. They live in the outlying municipalities. And that's going to be a problem for the Vancouver police when the city of Surrey has its own police force, and they'll expect they're going to lose 200 to 300 people.
To people who now live in Surrey or south of the Fraser.
Sure.
And, yeah.
Why should they come into Vancouver if they can get an equal opportunity to further their careers in policing in Surrey? So Surrey will be the beneficiary of many experienced officers who live in that area and will be able to further their careers.
We've talked a fair little bit here about frontline policing, but policing has become far more complex. We have cybercrime, we have terrorism, we have sophisticated gangs. Yeah. What has changed in the nature of policing that gives them the tools and the expertise that they require to start to deal with those kind of not just local, but become regional and at times international crime syndicates?
Well, they're better trained than at any time in the past, and we keep them better trained. We need to do that, particularly in the area of cybercrime, in the area of white-collar crime, which is an area that's been neglected over the years. So no question that the police have to have ongoing training in order to keep up with the demands of modern technological era.
There's also, we've seen the introduction of private security forces, private investigators, forensic specialists, and so on. How important is it that the police now start to work within this complex web of different providers, where they at times will say, you take over there, bring us in when needed, or vice versa, depending on the nature of the incident that's at hand?
In the interest of public interest, they have to work with private security people. Private security people have been hired by businesses essentially as loss prevention officers. So they're brought in because the police don't necessarily have the time to go and apprehend shoplifters. So they have private security. The police don't have the resources to go and keep vigil on vacant properties at nighttime. So firms are required by necessity to hire their own security. So the whole security area has now become a lot more complex. The real issue is how accountable are those people who are involved in private security? So those are things that we need to worry about. Mm-hmm. how trained are people who are involved in private security, and to what extent are they accountable to the public?
So we do have those mechanisms that are now in place. As far as police officers are concerned, where are we at developing that kind of accountability for private security personnel? Or are they just subject to the criminal code?
No, they're more than subject to the criminal code. The Ministry of the Attorney General and Solicitor General have been actively involved in the area of accountability, in the area of licensing, and so that proper qualifications are established for people who get involved in the licensing in the private security business, and it is a business. So yeah.
It truly is, but it's become an important component in maintaining a sense of security.
Yes.
When you take a look right now at the sense of safety that people have in British Columbia and the Greater Vancouver in particular, do you believe that people are appropriately informed about what levels of risk exist?
I think yes and no. I think the media do a pretty good job of explaining to us the public security issues that are out there. Mm-hmm. In fact, I think sometimes we're overly concerned. I've always said that if you read the Morning Province, sometimes you'd think we're living in Detroit, mm-hmm. because you see front page stories of violence that takes place in the community. In fact, we live in a pretty safe community here. Mm-hmm. Compare us to Seattle, Tacoma, or any of the large American cities, and we're pretty safe. There are most of the areas of the city you can walk around safely at nighttime. And I'm not taking things for granted, but we do a pretty good job here.
Right.
And our communities are pretty safe, relatively speaking.
Well, I did a fair bit of research about this a number of years ago. The thing that we fear the most is random acts of violence.
Absolutely.
And that really we do not have that kind of issue really on full display here in Vancouver. Where you're far more at risk is at home. Most violent crimes happen between people who know one another. All of that said, you're now undergoing a new study saying, okay, how do we ensure that we train police officers for the 21st century, for the next 25 to 30 years? What are the components that we need to be paying attention to? And for anybody who's looking at a career in law enforcement, what do they need to be aware of as they consider entering that field?
Well, I think you have to be better qualified academically than at any time in the past. And so part of what we're doing in the reexamination of the Justice Institute and the Police Academy is we're looking at the curriculum. Is the curriculum adequate, and is it there to serve the contemporary needs of today's officers? So that's what we're looking at. For instance, are today's officers mindful of the issues involving women, vulnerable women? I was involved in the Picton inquiry, mm-hmm. and we learned that at that time when the Picton matters were going on, that the police were not fully aware of the vagaries and the issues regarding vulnerable women. So,
especially Indigenous
absolutely,
women.
Absolutely. Yes. We've ignored the needs of Indigenous women and mm-hmm. Indigenous communities at large. Mm-hmm. So the police now have to be mindful of the risks that are involved in policing those areas, and they have to be mindful and better qualified in order to meet their needs.
So there has to be greater sensitivity to cultural
absolutely
differences. You know, when I take a look at the Vancouver Police Force, which is the police force that I'm the most familiar with, I think, okay, they've done a pretty good job of making sure that the police force is an accurate representation of the community that they are policing. You touched on that earlier. How then, as an individual who wants to enter the police force, do you say, my ethnic heritage actually is an asset?
It's important that we have a fair representation on police forces that represent the community at large. Mm-hmm. And that's not done just for cosmetic reasons. That's done to ensure that there is an appearance of fairness, an appearance of inclusivity, so that people know that our police force is representative of the community at large. We don't want an all-white police force.
No.
Because the perception is that they may not represent the community at large. And I think from the perspective of credibility in the community, that the police forces have to be represented. We need more women in policing. And in fact, the police have done a pretty good job of recruiting women, not anywhere near where they should be. The commissioner of the RCMP is a woman. And so the deputy commissioner of the RCMP here in Surrey is now a woman. The last one, Brenda Butterworth Carr, was a woman. So we're getting there. There's still a lot of work to be done.
That also brings up issues within the culture of policing. You have men and women working in such close quarters together. You have to ensure that you're creating a culture of respect where you're, understanding where boundaries are and cannot be crossed.
Right. No, absolutely.
And is that part of the training? Does that have to become part of the foundational training of somebody who wants to be a law enforcement
It's
officer?
fundamental that we train police officers to have respect for gender issues and multicultural issues and indigenous issues, and we need to do that. And you need proper training to do that. I mean, you get a person who has grown up in a particular community where he or she has not had any access to people from multicultural backgrounds or indigenous backgrounds. So we have to ensure that they are aware of customs, aware of the needs of those communities in order to achieve credibility there. But more than that, Stuart, if we're going to expect assistance from communities in solving crimes, for instance, Indo-Canadian gang violence is an issue. So I think the police have to have some kind of an inroad in that community so that when they go into those communities in order to solve crimes, that they're met with cooperation. And I remember a police chief from Los Angeles telling me, make friends with the multicultural communities, the inner city communities, because when we go into the inner city communities in Compton and some of those places, we are regarded as the invading army. And that's the problem that the Americans have, because the police forces down there haven't taken the time or the inclination to get involved in multicultural communities, the inner cities, and they get no cooperation.
That touches on an interesting point, the over-militarization of police forces and the kinds of barriers that creates. Are we dancing along that line here in Canada, and do we have to be careful about it?
I think we have to be very, very careful. And I think the police chiefs and those managers of the police are aware of that, because the greatest danger I think we have in Canada is that we cannot let our police forces fall into the same traps and the same milieu that the police forces have become involved in the U.S.
I'm happy to hear that you end on a positive note about us being able to maintain and improve on the relationship that has been building here in Canada. Thank you very much for coming in and doing this.
It's always good to be with you.